So we're now officially recording, and we have a quorum and may want to get rolling in a minute, but we'll come back to the point you just made. I may ask you to repeat it once we're in our discussion, because I think it is an important topic for the whole group to weigh in on. Let's see. It is 4:03, so why don't we get started? And is that okay, Allie? Good to go? Okay, great. Great. So I'm welcoming everybody. We are going to, first, we're going to do roll call, but I wanted to welcome Paul Fordham to our working group. Paul is with Homeward Bound. He's replacing Andrew Henning, who was representing Opening Doors Marin, but is no longer working at Opening Doors Marin. I'm not sure where he has gone, but he's left that position. And Paul, once we get rolling and get into roll call, I may ask you to introduce yourself and say a few words, but why don't we start with just who's here? And I'm going to read off the names. Omar Carrera.
Here.
Welcome, Omar. Don Dickinson.
Here.
Paul Fordham, you can.
Hey, everybody, I'm here. Sorry, I haven't got my camera on. I'm driving.
Okay.
I'm here and I'm from Homeward Bound.
Great. We'll come back to you to do an introduction a little bit later on. Linda Jackson.
Here.
Lorenzo Jones.
Here.
Cesar Lagleva.
Here.
Amy Lykover.
Here.
Diana Lopez.
Here.
Rena Lopez. It doesn't look like Rena has joined us yet. Tom Monahan. I don't see Tom on the screen yet. John Previtali.
Here.
Daniel Ryan.
Here.
And Joanne Webster.
I'm here, and Barry, I just need to inform you, I'm gonna have to jump off at some point in time just for a brief moment, but then I'll be back on.
No problem. Thanks for letting us know. So we will hopefully be joined by Rena and Tom at some point during the meeting. At this point, we're going to ask for any comments on the meeting summary of the March 17th meeting. And yes, go ahead, Amy.
Just a second. Excuse me. I wanted just to thank staff under bullet point number, the first bullet point under B, that we can note air quality issues in the inventory. I appreciate that. And then on page 3, the second bullet point, please post the list of sites on the website once it's finalized, possibly offer property owners the chance to add their sites if eligible. I didn't remember that being said, but I like that idea. That was said. I'm guessing it was said. That's great. And then let's see. That might have been it. I think that was it.
Great. Thank you, Amy.
You're welcome.
Any other comments? If not, I'll ask for a motion to approve the meeting summary. Linda?
Yeah, I did make a comment about assisted living in a court case that says that all of the units can be counted because they are where people live and call home. But the minutes don't quite reflect that, but I'm fine with the way it's written, and I will move approval of the minutes as they stand.
I
Thank
move
you.
approval of a friendly amendment to include Linda's comment.
Well, no, the comment is in the minutes. It just says that some of these units should be counted as units in assisted living, and actually the court case was that all of the units
Right.
are countable.
So that it'd be corrected.
Oh, you'd like to have that? Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
This
Okay.
needs to be accurate.
I'll accept your friendly amendment and make that a motion stand then.
And is there a second to that?
Second that.
I'm not sure who that was. But
John
we'll take.
Previtali.
Great, thank you, John. And well, if you're in favor, please raise your hand. We'll just do a visual. Great. Thank you all. So those will be deemed approved then. And I do want to ask Paul before we, at some point, Paul, if you're in a position where you can where you're not driving and it's safe to talk, if you could just introduce yourself to the group.
Sure, I could do that right now.
Okay,
So, Paul Fordham, I'm the co-CEO at Homeward Bound now. I've been with Homeward Bound for 17 years in different roles. And for those of you who don't know, Homeward Bound has 5 shelters, 12 supportive housing sites all around Marin County, focusing on housing homeless families and homeless adults. And I personally have been involved in 4 completed capital campaigns and developments, and have another 3 that we're currently involved in at Homeward Bound, including the Casa Buena, which was one of the home key sites in Corte Madera that will be opening next month. And also in San Rafael, we're part of the Mill Street redevelopment, so redoing our shelter with 32 units of supportive housing that will open up in August. So I've been around doing some of this work from the nonprofit development and operations side. I'm happy to join you all.
thank you, Paul, and welcome. And I'll also acknowledge that Tom Monahan and Rena Lopez have joined us. Welcome, Tom and Rena. So at this point, we have an opportunity for public comment. And I am just going to turn it over to Alexis to see if we have anyone in the public who would like to address our working group.
Oh, I saw a hand and then it went away. So if you would like to make a public comment, go ahead and raise your hand now. We'll just give everyone another moment. Oh yes, I see a hand raised. Grace, you should be able to talk now.
Yes. And I just want to mention that I had sent Barry Miller an email regarding housing policy.
Grace, we can't hear you very well.
Can you hear me better now?
Much better.
Okay. Anyway, I sent Barry an email. I was hoping that this committee could also discuss the housing policies regarding the fact that we have a glut of rental properties all over San Rafael for studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms. The biggest issue is that people can't afford them. And that's why there are so many vacancies. So in terms of policy changes, I recommend that we think about vouchers for those people that work in San Rafael, not only teachers and fire and police department, but also all types of healthcare workers. Anyone who works here and is low affordable to low income should be able to get a voucher of some kind. Otherwise, I don't understand why, all these places are vacant. And there are loads. I mean, the list I sent is just the tip of the iceberg. That just happens to be where I walk around or I've got errands to do. So anyway, that's it. Thank you so much for letting me comment on this.
Thank you, Grace.
I see no other hands raised, Barry.
Okay, great, thanks.
I think it might be good to, during the discussion section that you have I would like to provide a few comments, if that's okay. If we wait for that, any comments that you want to have us address?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure, Ali, I think we're there. I think we're at item 5A. We're up to the presentation on housing constraints. So if you just to kind of introduce that or respond.
Well, I think what I want to say, and this is kind of related to some discussions that have occurred in prior meetings as well. There are 2 different, there are many paths for addressing the housing needs. And one path is what we're doing now is having to update our housing element. We're addressing the need for, how we're going to accommodate
enough sites for accommodating the RENA obligation. And, you know, looking at our constraints and then establishing like what else could we do? Separately, there are specifics that the city may want to do and pursue as part of ongoing policy work that would not necessarily be part of this housing element work. So I wanted to make sure that the group understood that there may be some conversations or some input provided that, you know, is anticipation of having us address certain specific policies within the housing element. That may not happen in the housing element, but doesn't mean that it's not going to be looked at. It's just, you know, there are different ways to address the housing need. And I just, you know, given Grace's comment, which I appreciate hearing, I just wanted to make sure that the group understood that as well.
Thank you, Allie. Great. So I think we're going to move into a presentation on housing constraints and then have really the rest of the meeting focused on a discussion. And I guess I'll preface this kind of in the same way that Allie just did, which is that the constraints presentation and even the text in the housing element is kind of structured to meet the state requirements for the, you know, under the government code. We're required in the housing element to look at certain constraints, but I also would like to kind of frame this as there also are opportunities that maybe, you know, we're not just looking at this as negatives. Here are all the things that are stopping us, but really how can we turn some of these into opportunities or create opportunities? So I would ask that we all be thinking about that. When we get to the discussion at the end, this is probably 10 or 15-minute presentation, but when we get to that discussion, the stuff you're going to see on the slides, a lot of it is fairly technical. It's related to our zoning standards. It's related to, you know, to things like our parking requirements and so forth. And there are a few of you on the screen who either have backgrounds in city planning or development who, you know, we may lean on a little bit to do some of the heavier lifting in the conversation because you've had to deal with this stuff directly. Others of you may not have had to work with the city's zoning regulations, but you have experienced constraints to the kind of housing that we need in San Rafael. So I want to cast kind of a wide net and say this is really meant to be a robust conversation about how we can make things better. And, you know, we have obstacles, we have constraints in the city. We've talked about our needs, we've talked about our sites. Really, from this point on, we're going to start to shift into policies and programs. So when we get into that conversation and discussion, you know, I just want to encourage everyone to share their thoughts and participate. It doesn't have to be, oh, I think the setback should be 5 feet instead of 10 feet. It can also be, here's what I'd like the city to do. Here's what I think our government, you know, our local government can do to make it easier to build housing or to find housing. And, you know, Grace's point is kind of in the spirit of that, I think, looking at innovative steps the city can take to improve housing conditions and access to housing throughout the city. So I just kind of wanted to put that out there as food for thought as we set the stage for the conversation. Did anyone want to comment on that before I share my screen and go through the PowerPoint? I don't know if there are initial thoughts or reactions to that. Go ahead, Cesar, please.
Yeah, this is much more, perhaps, maybe it's not connected to your just earlier comment, but will we also have an opportunity to review what is based on the current plan and the existing plan, and really consider some of those things that have not been accomplished or achieved, and then crosswalk it to the future plan?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to
yes.
get a perspective.
Yeah, I guess I would say if there are specific things that you're thinking of, that would be, you know, easier to grasp than, you know, easier for us to address if there's a particular program and you're wondering, why didn't this get done? What were the reasons? That would be, I think, easier than just the bigger general question.
Because I tried looking into documents that we've received, and I didn't see anything that have been checklisted as accomplished, or maybe I overlooked it. You know, accomplished, not accomplished, partially accomplished, and so forth. Because I guess part of my objective here is making sure that we do not duplicate anything that already exists, but it's just a matter of crosswalking it from the existing to the new.
Right. Okay. Yeah, there was a table that was put together way at the beginning of the process where we tried to do that, but that was a few months ago, and we can come back to some of those items too, because one of the lessons learned from that was we accomplished a lot, but we didn't accomplish everything.
Cool.
And the question then is, why didn't we accomplish everything, and what were some of the obstacles? Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
Amy, did you want to add something?
No, I mean, mine may sound rather trite, but I just wanted to say it's always best to look for opportunities and obstacles. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Great, thanks. Okay. Hopefully I have the right PowerPoint on the screen. And everyone can see the screen?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So again, in terms of where we are in the process, we have gone through at this point 4 meetings where we've talked about the context for the housing element, the evaluation. We had the meeting on the needs assessment and the meeting on housing sites. And now we're talking about constraints. And as we just kind of reframed it, constraints and opportunities. Our next meeting is going to be focused on fair housing and equity issues, and then we'll be talking about policies and programs. We're going to talk on the next agenda item a little bit more about our process for the remaining meetings of the working group. So I'll hold off on going into detail on those other bullets at the bottom. So the definition of constraints, this is actually something that's set by the government code. And a constraint is a factor that impedes the maintenance, improvement, or development of housing for all income levels. So the state essentially defines a constraint, and this is what we're tasked with evaluating. And they identify 2 different types of constraints, governmental and non-governmental. Just think of it in a really simple way, the governmental constraints are the things that the city of San Rafael can control, and the non-governmental constraints are things we have less control over. We can maybe influence the non-governmental constraints, but we can't make them go away completely. So with the governmental constraints, there are specific topic areas that really we're focusing more on those in this presentation. I'm going to walk through a series of slides that touch on most of these points now, and then we'll talk at the end. So starting with the general plan, in some communities, the general plan can be a constraint to development in that it may be very out of date. It may not reflect current housing needs and issues. We don't believe that to be the case in San Rafael because we just updated the general plan. This is General Plan 2040 that was adopted last August, and I would describe it as a pro-housing plan that recognizes the urgent needs we have in our community. It is a really important document because it's a framing document for where the city wants to go with respect to housing and growth and conservation and environmental protection and so on. The new general plan does include policies that talk about housing needs and priorities, including some of the sustainability working group members. We also have the element, which I think
Barry, your audio is getting really spotty.
Oh, okay. Yes, I see a notice here that, can everyone hear me okay now?
Mhm.
All right, sorry about that. I got one of those pop-up things that says my internet's unstable. Yeah, so I'm just going to move on to the next slide, but just to make the point that the general plan is not currently viewed as a constraint, at least by staff, to housing production in the city. So zoning in San Rafael is really the crux of this analysis. The zoning ordinance is where we lay out what uses are allowed in the city, what permits are required to build different types of housing. It's where we have all of our basic development standards. And in San Rafael today, we have 6 single-family zoning districts, 8 multifamily zoning districts, 7 commercial districts where housing is permitted. We have downtown, which has its own zoning code, and then several other zones that have some limited provisions for housing, which we're going to go over in the next few slides. Housing is not allowed in the city's industrial zones, and that's a policy decision that was made many years ago, and it's still reinforced, I would say, and affirmed in the general plan. So I won't go into details. Obviously, this is a lot of data, and you're going to see 4 slides like this one. But the point here is that for every zoning district in the city, there are certain standards that are set for the minimum lot area. This is how big a parcel or how small a parcel can be. The minimum lot width, in other words, you can't have you can't create a subdivision with lots that are smaller than the numbers that you see here. The percentage of the lot that can be covered by structures, including homes, the maximum height of a building, and then the setbacks. These are the distances that the structure has to be from the front yard, the side yard, and the rear yard. In the single family zones, you can see here, these are in order from the largest lots, which is really a 2-acre minimum lot size. We don't have a lot of this zoning in San Rafael, all the way up to what's called R5, which is 5,000 square foot lots. This is a pretty typical pattern that we see in communities that were developed in the same manner as San Rafael. Many of the other cities in Marin County have similar standards, front yard setbacks, rear yard setbacks, and so forth. So this really defines the envelope on which housing can be built in single family zones. So here we're moving into the multifamily zones. So we have separate zoning districts for duplexes, which is what the DR stands for, medium density residential districts, which are in this MR band, and then the high density residential districts. And once again, there are certain limits on the number of units per acre of land that are permitted, and different standards for lot coverage and height and setbacks and so forth. So in the technical document that accompanies the housing element, one of the things we're looking at is what's the cumulative effect of all of these standards? Is there something in these standards that makes it impossible to achieve the kind of development we need in the city? For example, if you look at the density in our high density residential zone, it's 43.6 units per acre. You can cover 60% of the lot with a building, but that's the same limit of coverage that applies in a zone that's got 24 units per acre. So you sort of think, maybe this should be 70%. So we go through this exercise of looking at all of our standards and evaluating whether they are constraints.
Barry, can you really quickly go over the density that is allowed in the high density residential, the range? I think
Sure.
that's important for the group to know as well.
Sure. In the high density residential range, you've got zoning districts that go that allow 24 units per acre, 29 units per acre, and 43 units per acre. And just unfortunately, I don't have photos of what these densities look like, but 43 units per acre would most likely be a 3-story apartment building, possibly a 4-story building. But this is we're not talking about high-rise development here. But what's significant is the general plan for San Rafael allows this 43 units per acre in all of the high density residential areas on the map, but you can't actually get to that density unless you're in this HR1 zone. So you could be in one of these other zoning districts and you're not able to reach the maximum density that's allowed by the general plan. And we can come back to some of these things later in if there are questions on that. So San Rafael does allow multifamily housing in many of its commercial zoning districts, and really they're called commercial zones, but they're mixed use for all intents and purposes. You can build housing, you can build commercial uses, you can build structures that have commercial on the bottom and residential on the top. So there are different opportunities to build housing in different forms within these commercial zones. And here again, you see the number of units per acre varies from 21 in the marine marine district to 43 in many of these districts. A lot of this, I know it's kind of wonky and we won't dive deep into it. I think the point I want to make is that the setback requirements in the commercial and mixed use zones are more relaxed, they're more generous. You don't necessarily have to keep your building as far away from the property line and so forth in some of these areas as you would in a residential neighborhood. Then we have the downtown area, and this is a two-part slide because I want to explain that in downtown San Rafael, many of the traditional zoning standards don't apply anymore. And this is only as of last August. The city adopted a new zoning code for downtown San Rafael, which is called a form-based code. I have another slide that talks a little bit more about that. Previously in downtown, there were limits for density, the number of units per acre, and other of these variables. But now really downtown residential development is only governed by these height limits that you see here. So these are, from 30 feet up to 70 feet. And that's really what dictates the envelope of the building. There are some regulations for the setbacks, but those are fairly generous. And then there are bonuses. You can build taller than the numbers that you see here if you include affordable housing in your development project. And again, this is a simplified version. As you can imagine, there are a lot of nuances and exceptions and specific requirements that go along with most of these standards. I think the important point here about the form-based code in downtown is, although there's more flexibility in the size of the number of units that you put in the building, it's very prescriptive when it comes to what the building looks like or how it fits on the parcel. So you have standards for the maximum length of the building, the height of the ground floor. The buildings are required to step back, meaning that you get up to the third floor and then you have to sort of zig and zag in so that the buildings don't cast shadows on the street. There are specific requirements for the frontages where the building meets the street. And if you're next to a historic resource, there are specific requirements about how you step the building down to avoid impacts to that historic resource, where the parking needs to be located. So although there are fewer standards on the number of units, there are additional standards for the design. In the other zoning districts, we have a couple of places where housing is allowed, but with some, some caveats. In the Lindaro mixed use zone, which is a zoning district that is south of downtown in the general vicinity of Davidson School, Middle School. This is where it's mostly industrial uses today, but changing a little bit. And there's live work uses that are allowed where you can live and work in the same structure. Public and quasi-public, this is the zoning district that applies to government land and to institutional land in the city. and residential uses are permitted in that zone, subject to a density that's actually fairly low in many locations. And then planned development, which is a special designation that the city uses to allow variations from the zoning standards.
Barry, I see that
Yeah.
Amy, oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, because it's not in the packet, if staff could put on a link into chat of where a map that has these different zoning districts lives online, so that I can follow along a little bit better. I've
Sure.
seen it before, but rather than me look for it, I think everybody would benefit.
Great, thanks. And I may see if Alexis can do that while we're going through the presentation.
Barry, I'm there right now, so I'll go ahead and.
Oh, great, thanks. So I'm going to move on to parking requirements. And again, as with all of the slides, there are exceptions to each of these rules, but and various conditions and fine print in the zoning ordinance. But these are the number of parking spaces that are required depending on what type of unit you're building. There are, for example, 2 covered spaces required when you build a single family home in the city. If you build a studio and studio apartment, that's 1 space per unit. The requirement is lower if you're in downtown San Rafael, because we have public transportation options and a more walkable scale, and you know, an environment that may lend itself to living without a car and so forth. So there's more flexibility in these areas. So we're also looking at our parking standards, seeing how they compare with other cities, not just in Marin County, but cities that are similar in size and character to San Rafael. And if our requirements are way out of line with what other cities are requiring, you know, we would look to make some adjustments. We're also, I think, constantly revisiting our parking standards to think about how can we encourage bicycle parking, electric vehicles, and clean air vehicles, and look for opportunities to not overbuild our parking. If there's a vacant parking spaces available in the evening that may be occupied during the daytime, we can look at ways to share parking and reduce the requirements. This is one of the biggest costs in development, so hopefully we can ask Tom and Daniel to maybe provide some perspective on how parking standards impact the feasibility of projects. So just a quick summary of our zoning constraints. I mentioned some of the multifamily zones are lower than the general plan densities. We also have a couple of zoning districts where the residential densities are fairly low. And just as an example, public and quasi-public land that's right next to the SMART station in North San Rafael is zoned to allow only 21 to 24 units per acre. So we are looking at these things and saying, this may be an area where we can adjust the zoning to achieve higher densities in places where we want it. Multifamily parking requirements, we're actually pretty comparable to other cities of San Rafael's size, but it's still expensive to provide particularly the structured parking in places like downtown. Our form-based code, we just adopted it, and it was intended to eliminate constraints. It does also include some new design requirements. And so I think we're monitoring the new form-based code for downtown to make sure that it isn't going to be a constraint with the many design standards and requirements it has. We have new state rules for accessory dwelling units that make it much easier to build an in-law apartment on a property. And then we have Senate Bill 9, SB 9, which may create new opportunities in our single family zoning districts. And we'll talk more about that in the discussion, but there may be some zoning changes that are coming relating to how that gets implemented. So again, apologies for the density of the information on the screen here, but we're required under state law to analyze what types of permits are required for different types of uses. So every place you see a P on this table, that means that this dwelling type, single family dwelling, is a permitted use in all of the zones that we just showed you on the previous slides. So if it's a C, that means it's conditionally permitted, and that in many cases means that there's a planning commission hearing required. So it makes it a little more time consuming and costly to go through that process. Where this gets to be critical for the state is, for example, state law requires that we have at least one zone that allows emergency shelter. We are required by state law to allow residential care facilities for persons with disabilities in all of our zoning districts. We're required to treat transitional housing and housing with supportive services the same way we treat any other housing type in each zoning district. So we've gone through this exercise of evaluating different housing types.
What does the A stand for?
The A is an administrative use permit. That's a permit that's issued by the planning director, I believe.
And that just to kind of clarify that the purpose of that really is to check performance standards.
Right.
And that's an area that, we could evaluate as a kind of a change, rather than requiring it to be an administrative use permit. It could just be a zoning check, because that's essentially what we're doing. But yeah, thank you for asking that, Amy. That's a good question on that one.
And Allie, are you sending that by way of email, the map by way of email? Because there's no chat that I see.
Yeah, I realize there's no chat. I did send it to Alexis and realized she didn't have chat either. So she's emailing that to you. So it may be in each of your email boxes right now.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we just have a few more slides here. Inclusionary housing, which is the requirement that a certain percentage of all of the dwellings in a new development be set aside for lower income households. The state requires that we address that as both an opportunity to create new affordable units, but also as a potential constraint. And the reason that this can be a constraint is if we set that percentage too high, then it creates an obstacle to housing being built because it becomes less financially viable for a developer to build a project. So we actually have to go through an analysis in this of whether the percentage that we've set is appropriate. And the city's actually done quite a bit of work on this in the last couple of years and actually reduced the percentage requirement in response to its findings that, yes, the 20% requirement was making it more difficult to build housing. So that's been reduced. One of the things about inclusionary housing is that when you include affordable units in your development, you get you have an opportunity for a density bonus, which gives you additional dwelling units. So you can actually add more housing units if you include affordable units. And this table that you see here, which is basically the state law for all cities and counties in California, which tells you if you set aside a percentage of units for these different income groups, this is what the bonus is that you get to build on top. So here's an example in this bullet right here. Providing 2 low-income units in an 8-unit project gets you a 50% bonus, 4 more units, and the bonus units can be market rate. They don't have to be affordable units. So there are some benefits to the developer to including affordable housing. And again, I won't dwell too long on this topic. We can come back to it if there are questions, but just to make the point that the city offers local density bonuses in lieu of the state bonus, both in the general plan and the downtown plan. But the state density bonuses have become much more generous in recent years, and it's hard to beat what they're offering, which include waivers from most of the city's development or zoning requirements. Additional constraints that we analyze in this include our design review guidelines and permit requirements, our building code. So for example, if San Rafael adopts a special building code requirement that no other city in Marin County is looking at or adopting, and it costs more to build a house in San Rafael or an apartment. Because of that requirement, we need to be looking at that and thinking, you know, what is the benefit provided by that? You know, whether it's fire resistant construction or all electric, you know, construction and so forth. Site improvement requirements. In other words, what are we requiring developers to build to improve when they come in with a project, whether it's street improvements or providing a park or other things that they must do in order to build something, could be a constraint. The permit processing times, how many hearings does it take to get a permit to build something? And our fees, some of the fees are for planning and building purposes. Some of them are impact fees. For example, we require that you pay a fee for, the school district requires that there's a fee paid for schools. We have a park impact fee, traffic fees, and so forth. And then the cost of connecting to our utilities. So these are all things that are analyzed. Moving to the non-governmental constraints, these are the things the city has less control over. Financing, and we talked a little bit at the last meeting about tax credit availability. I do have a couple of maps I'm going to share before we wrap up this presentation. Construction costs have really increased dramatically the last few years. This includes land costs, labor costs, and material costs. The availability of water is a constraint we take very seriously. You know, we still have to meet our RENA and demonstrate that we have the capacity to do that, but then you have issues related to drought and the availability of water service, moratoria, and so forth that are that can impact our ability to actually build housing. Community opposition, what we're really talking about there is the fact that some projects are reduced in size and scale, and that the density that ultimately is approved is significantly less than what might be allowed by zoning. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing. It's just a reality that causes projects to cost more and take longer. I put two maps in just because this came up at the last meeting, and I thought it was important to come back to these two maps. Daniel, thank you for bringing up the issue of tax credit availability. This is the map of San Rafael that shows where it's called the TCAC opportunity map, and it essentially shows you which areas are considered high resource or low resource areas. And this affects the eligibility of certain affordable housing projects for tax credits. So highest resource areas right now are where it's where most of the tax credits are going. This is also, we talked again at the last meeting about difficult to develop areas and qualified census tracts. And you can see that a lot of downtown San Rafael, central San Rafael, and kind of the inner ring of neighborhoods are not identified as qualified census tracts or difficult to develop areas. And yet much of our hope for the future is that we do get development in downtown San Rafael. So this creates a little bit of a dilemma in terms of looking for tax credit financing in some of the areas where we're most interested in getting affordable housing. So here are the discussion questions that we came up with for today's meeting. And as I mentioned, we kind of want this to be a little bit free flowing. I'm going to stop talking after this slide, and hopefully we'll hear from working group members about these questions. What constraints are of greatest concern, and what steps can the city take to reduce them? How can we avoid unintended consequences if the constraints are reduced? For example, if we say our fees are too high, let's get rid of them. Where do we get the funding to cover the costs that we're currently covering with those fees? What steps can the city take to address non-governmental constraints? And really, I think number 5 is most important, and that's, are there other constraints that should be addressed? And in your experiences working in the housing realm in San Rafael, what are some of the other constraints that we missed in this presentation and discussion and you would like to talk about. So thanks for bearing with us again through a lot of detail, and I'll open it up to comments. Let me just ask before we do that, Ali, did you want to add anything to any of the information?
No, I don't think so. I think that, you know, just thinking about what I already said. I just going back to that slide about the densities and what our current zoning allows. We have our general plan where we've established a density range, and we really try to look for opportunities for developers to build within the higher density ranges. And yet our zoning district has limitations in the high density range that don't allow for the maximum development opportunities. So that's something that would be helpful to just kind of, if you have any comments on that. But other than that, I don't. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, and yeah, if y'all could use the raise hand, that would be great. We'll queue you up and can start asking. Go ahead, John.
Oh yeah, thanks, Barry. Yeah, I think I've mentioned this before, but I'm a big proponent of sort of reducing the constraints around single-family homes in neighborhoods that are zoned for single-family homes, specifically to allow more housing there, smaller housing, affordable housing, mixed-use housing, mixed-use income housing, or mixed income, I guess is what it's called. And so I'm just curious, like, I'd be interested in hearing other people's opinion about that. I feel like we have a long history of, for lack of a better term, segregation in the city. And I don't think it's intentional, but I think that it is, it's really been supported, unfortunately, by single family home zoning, where people who are often white and don't have high incomes or intergenerational wealth can afford to buy homes in those neighborhoods. And so I'd like to see less expensive homes in those neighborhoods.
Thanks, John. And we'll go to Amy, and if folks would like to respond to John's comment, please do.
Go ahead and let Thomas go first, because I've spoken already quite a bit, but yeah, calling me down the queue a little bit.
Great. Tom, thanks. I think we're all really interested in your perspectives on this topic as a residential developer who has had firsthand experience with the zoning ordinance. So have at it.
Oh, great. Well, hi, everybody. I missed the meeting last week. I was on a flight and my flight got delayed. So sorry about that. I'm very interested in this topic and this group. I think it's a great job, Barry, that you're doing. The last presentation you went through today, I thought was very well thought through and presented. And it illustrates, I think, the challenges that we have. We all have a common goal to create more housing. And yet we've got, certain constraints and obstacles in the way. And that always seems to be the problem. One way or another, there's always something in the way. So I just want to touch on a couple of things that I think my comments primarily are centered around the downtown area. So we're really focused on that right now. And so my comments really are not aimed at some of the other issues and the other zones in San Rafael, as we're focusing on the downtown. And so we have several projects that are going through with the new downtown plan, which is great. I mean, we're really thrilled to see the work that's been done over the last several years to create that, the downtown plan, and we're excited about that. So we're trying to do some higher density projects. And some of the points that you mentioned about constraints are certainly factors I think, I don't know that this is the correct forum to get into all of them, but the the balancing of parking is really a very key one. As you said, Barry, it's very expensive to provide parking. And when you have a form-based code, the area above grade is really very valuable. And so you really don't want to park there because you're not getting much value. So that forces you underground parking. And underground parking is very expensive. And then there are certain constraints within the downtown plan that I think are inadvertent. There's one that we ran into on our project on 4th Street that has a 25-foot setback from a side street to a parking garage. So if your lot's only 50 feet deep, 25 feet. So that's a little, there's some nuances I think that we should probably visit in those standards. But importantly, parking now is still driving a lot of the costs of projects. So the more that we can do, ride share and other solutions that limit the parking burden on an individual project, we think that'll be a big help. The other thing that really you touched on, and I think it's not exactly a governmental issue, but it's something that we have to focus on, and that's water availability. We're just coming out of a bad drought, and MMWD is certainly trying to handle that. And there were different suggestions made about desal plants and bringing a new pipeline in and new water availability. We're still concerned about that. So I think anything that the city can do to encourage MMWD to help, make new supply available, I think that's going to be the biggest constraint that we see going forward. So if the RHNA numbers for San Rafael are 3,000 units or more than that, that's 3,000 hookups just in San Rafael. And if you multiply that times all of Marin, that's a big number for MMWD. So I think we should, as a working group or whatever, focus some attention on that. I'm not sure how to solve that problem, but that's something that will, be a very limiting constraint. So whatever we do as a group, if Ally got out her approval stamp and started approving plans, they'd all have to get water. So that is a big concern and a big constraint. The offsite improvements is also something that I would, in terms of a constraint, I would try to be careful with. All cities want great streets, and they want that infrastructure maintained and upgraded. And San Rafael has got a couple of different fees that you pay as you're going through construction. And then the conditions of approval sometimes can be very costly. So we haven't gotten to that stage yet with Department of Public Works, but I think, DPW really needs to be brought in as an ally to the process rather than as a constraint or a hindrance. Because, certainly everybody wants to do their fair share and contribute, but the accumulated weight of fees and permitting fees and water, sewer, school fee, park fee, and by the time you get through all that, and then Public Works then has their process. And so we've run into that on projects, that those costs have been very, very high and somewhat limiting in various projects. So I would point that out as another area to, to focus on. So those are just a couple of things. I mean, I think it's a great opportunity to talk about how to get more housing in general. So everything we can do to smooth the path ahead for developers at every stage, whether it's individuals or commercial developers, nonprofit developers, joint ventures, we're all going through the same path. So the more we can do to smooth that path, I think the more housing we'll see at the end of that process. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Yep. And we may come back to you at some point with some more questions for you too.
Sure.
Don, go ahead.
I wanted to go through a couple of points raised in your PowerPoint, and in the order actually in which you presented them. First one is the parking for a single-family home. I was actually not aware that the city required 2 covered parking spaces, but the cost of covered parking space is considerable. And at the same time, so many covered parking spaces are actually not used for parking, whereas an open parking space generally is, because it's available. You can't store whatever in there. So I would certainly look at changing that to make smaller single-family homes more affordable. You mentioned the public and quasi-public zoning restriction of 21 to 24 units per acre. And on the telephone the other day, we had talked about the Civic Center Christmas tree lot. And I think it would be, I mean, I think that has some potential, but I think it'd be ridiculous to limit that to the low 20 units per acre. And just as an example of a publicly owned site that has potential for housing at a higher density. On the chart, you showed some of the decision-making is done, or some of the approvals require conditional use permit, which is done administratively. And I would suggest looking at making that a true ministerial decision, where you basically just someone, presumably a staff person, goes down a checklist and sees to check whether the project is consistent without requiring the legally required findings for a use permit, which are sometimes onerous. In terms of inclusionary housing, I've always been a big advocate of that. And I personally think it's unfortunate the city reduced it from 20% to 10%. And what struck home to me was reading the article about Northgate, which I think most people think is an appropriate place for below market rate housing, and seeing that first phase 900 units and 90 units are going to be the only below market rate units required by the city. I mean, a property owner could do more, but the project description in the newspaper indicated that that's all you're going to get. And we don't have a problem with market rate housing, and inclusionary is one way to make sure that if market rate housing is being built, that at least some below market rate housing is built or subsidized through fees as part of that. And finally, in terms of the fees, the information we got about constraints was from 8 years ago, and some of it I know was out of date. But I was surprised to see that San Rafael's fees for both single family and multifamily were about 30% higher than the average for the rest of the county. I mean, that really surprised me. And I'd suggest that in doing this constraints analysis, you look more closely at why that is the case, because the fees are a critical thing in terms of being able to finance any project, but particularly affordable housing. And I'm just surprised that San Rafael is so much higher than what appears to be the average Marin County, if that information is still current. Those are my comments.
Great, thank you, Don. And Joanne?
Thanks, Barry. And I was listening when I had to pop off. I just was in the guest room, I guess that's what you call it, but I did hear you all. So the number one complaint, and I mean, you heard Tom speak, and hopefully Daniel will speak too, is the sheer cost of building any kind of housing. It's, you know, these projects have been entitled, and I think it was Cesar had asked, you know, at the beginning, you know, why are we not seeing these projects being built? And they're being entitled, but they absolutely can't get the financing. because their margins are so thin. So I do think a temporary reduction in the inclusionary number of units required is meant to spur new development of all levels of housing. So Dawn, I don't disagree with you that the Northgate project, I would love to see more there. They're actually going to build 12%. That's what the developer told us. But I have a feeling that if we were mandating 20%, we wouldn't see much of anything built there. So that's an example of how it is working. And I think the city can look at that policy later. And once we reach a threshold of number of units built. The other thing we hear from developers all the time is how difficult the review process is. So if we could have policies in place, and I think the city is doing a really, really good job right now with this ministerial review. And if you can continue that, so streamlining the review process and creating flexibility is really important for the developer. I think we also need to be really, really clear on plan checks. I have heard many, many times that it gets delayed, it gets sent back, there's some confusion. The developer will resubmit it and somebody, didn't get to it. I think time is money, so it's really, really important that they're very clear on the plan checks. Tom talked about the off-site improvements. It would be really great if we had some sort of cross-departmental communications. So especially on these larger projects, if all of the departments were on the same page. And I also want to say this, I know there's current commissioners and planning commissioners, but I really think it's important that all of the commissioners are on the same page. I've seen so many times where, you're asking a developer to plant a different kind of tree or to, have a different material used in the building. That costs money. They have to go back and redo that. So if you can have a greater flexibility would be really beneficial, and it would loosen the constraint. So those are my comments.
Great, thanks. Linda?
Thank you. I'm a bit of a fire hose too, so I'll get started here. I want to pick up on where both Tom and Joanne talked about with the conditions of approval. So there's the fees and exactions are listed, but the conditions of approval for the sidewalk replacement and for street resurfacing, when there's already a fee to cover the impact on the streets, and on undergrounding, which is a huge impact on a project that I'm working on helping right now. The undergrounding requirement is going to add $20,000 to $70,000 per unit. And I have yet to see the ordinance or the policy, the statement that sets the basis and the parameters for that. Another one is the fire hydrant. If you have the fire hydrant near your project has not been upgraded, then you have to pay for the full fire hydrant. You're supposed to be getting reimbursed as other projects come in along the way. I don't know if that ever happens. So, and that's not a small and insignificant, particularly for people that are doing smaller projects. And another one is, and I think this one myself is a good one, but if you are redeveloping or improving a project and relocating low-income renters, which you should do, but that is an additional fee or impact on the property owner or the developer to pay for that. That's one where I think it is worth the cost. But I do think it also needs to be noted and included in that. And there may be a need to look at exemptions or waivers for smaller projects on these, but the conditions of approval can, I think, vastly outprice the fees that the city is charging. Another one is looking at the cost for home adaptations for older people and people with disabilities who want to modify their kitchen or their bathroom, and what is the cost of the fees for that, and particularly for low-income homeowners that are facing these the need to do this. The live-work zoning regs, I actually wrote those way back in the day. I think it was about 30 years ago. They never worked, and I really think they should either be ditched or something else entirely different, because they have never really worked in facilitating live work development. A comment on public, quasi-public. the intent of that, I remember when we rezoned that in the general plan that was adopted in 2004, there's that public, quasi-public would be a high density at the top of the density for zoning purposes. So I know that that was the intent back then, and I think Don Dickinson talked to that, and I think we should look at that. Also with Don, I'm with you on covered parking. I hate to say I wrote that rule too, a good 30 something years ago. And, you know, Don, right? Things change, and you're right. They're really just storage units. And I think that's actually might be in violation of state law about ADUs, which say that ADUs can be in a garage. So actually what we're telling property owners is they're gonna have to build another garage if they want to convert their garage. It doesn't make any sense. I don't know, talk to our lobbyist at the city and see, do we need to lobby for changes in that tax credit map or standards? I'm not sure, I don't know, or lobby for other financing options that we can access. The inclusionary ordinance in the 90s was only 10%. We got hundreds and hundreds of inclusionary units with that 10%. But we also had a redevelopment agency, and we had a lot more financing at the state and feds. So I'm not sure 10% works. And I know Joanne, you know, the chambers really pushed for that change. It's 5%. And, you know, I'd love to see something between 5 and 10, because I agree we're just not getting much, but the developer has to carry a lot more than they had to do back in the day. So unless we get real help. Tiny homes are wonderful. The restrictions in Marin and our local jurisdictions in Marin prohibit these. And whether there's any way we can look at making them be possible to be added in and used, because what we need is extremely low income housing. And that means very small units that can help house 1 or 2 people comfortably. And so we need to have options for that, and that includes tiny homes. In terms of single family zoning, I think that it is important to keep that. It's a viable way for families to raise their children. It's not the best for older people when they don't have anybody else around them. There are laws that really are opening up a little bit more though, and that would be SB 9. It's not, as we are told in the press, the ruin of single family neighborhoods, because they have to be owner occupied and they can't be next to each other. But SB 9 does allow for single family lots to be split. They can have an accessory unit, they can have a junior accessory unit. So there are ways that are coming around to allow for modest infill in single family neighborhoods that will fit in. One of the things we looked at way back when was allowing triplexes on corner lots. I don't know whether that's something we'd want to think about in terms of SB 9. But on a corner lot, which tends to be larger, has 2 street frontages, whether that could be, those would be primo lots, if you will, for SB 9. I'm pretty close to the end of mine, I think. Oh, and I just wanted to share. So in high density and medium density zoning districts, can we get rid of the density altogether? So I live, you all know my building. It's across the street from Johnny Donuts, and it's the new building. It's 60 units to the acre. Everybody loves this building. There's only 10 units in it. There's only 2 rooms in each unit, and we're a very mixed group of people who live here. But that's 60 units to the acre. The developer was able to make that work on this site. When we put a density limit on it, that puts controls on the developer that he's got to work around, rather than being able to first design the project to the parameters, the height, the box, and then figure out what's the market that he's trying to reach. So, or she's trying to reach. So that's my list, Barry.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Thank
just
you,
have to
Linda.
interject for a moment. And by the way, Linda, I love your building also. It's fabulous. I just wanted to make sure that no one thought I was suggesting we get rid of single family housing zoning entirely. That's not what I was suggesting. I was just suggesting that we add some infill, convert some areas to multifamily, like you said, triplexes and whatnot. So just wanted to clarify that.
Thanks, John. Omar?
Thank you, Barry. I will say this, that was a lot of information to digest. And so I'm trying to see how can I be the most helpful, and also trying to connect this information with information that was presented to us in the past sessions. From all the sites that you guys identify as the potential sites for housing production, it would be great to see how we build those properties on top of the map of the use of the land that Alexa just shared with all of us, to understand what are the sites that will need some zoning reform, right? We are talking about constraints, and I see the entire constraints across all the city, but are we talking about a zoning reform for a specific sites? And if so, can we have that conversation to understand how can we reduce the requirements around parking, density, and many of the constraints that you have presented to us today, versus having this broad conversation about the entire city when maybe we don't have to. So again, it would be helpful for me to have a clarification point. Are we looking at these constraints based on the size that was presented to us? And if so, it will be very helpful for us to have that visual to see where those sites are and what constraints they present at this point.
Thanks, Omar. That's a good point. I might just respond to it before we go on. And I think what we're doing is both. I think we're looking both at citywide constraints in all of these zoning districts, but then we also are looking at the individual sites to see if the zoning works for the kinds of housing that we need. And if it doesn't work, figuring out if we need to rezone those properties to different districts. I mean, sort of what we did downtown was say, for years and years, the city has wanted housing downtown, but the zoning didn't work. It got us some housing, but it didn't get us the vision that we wanted. So we went through this process of doing new zoning for downtown. We've designated Southeast San Rafael and Canal as a priority development area. That's the first step for us to get money to do a plan, a grant to do a plan that looks at the zoning for the housing sites in that area, but also all of the other zoned properties. I don't know that we're going to get to all of that in the housing element, but we're certainly setting the stage to make some zoning changes down the road to some of those properties, and the same for Northgate also. So that I think that's really the strategy is it's kind of multi-layered. We're not going to go site by site through all of the opportunity sites and say, okay, do these zoning standards add up for each individual site? Because there are more than 100 sites on that list. But there's a sort of a reality check for all of this. We have to figure out what the realistic capacity is for each of the sites, and if it's low, we have work to do. Yeah, I don't know that completely gets at the question, but it's an important point. We'll keep working on that one.
No, thank you. I mean, it's clear that I need more information to understand how I can support the work that you are doing, especially when we touch zoning reform. But yeah, it's helpful at this point.
Yeah. I also, Omar, I was thinking too, because I know the Canal Alliance is interested in developing additional housing or converting existing housing into affordable housing. If there are any specific constraints related to those conversions that that we should be aware of, the taking existing buildings and making them, instead of market rate, making them affordable, are there obstacles that we should be addressing to that? So that's another issue. Okay, let's come back to Amy, and then I see a few other hands, so we'll go to.
Thanks. I'm actually really happy that I was able to listen to to everyone else. And I wanted to just echo a number of the issues that Linda brought up. And thank you, Linda, for being so knowledgeable and having been a part of many of the innovations, even if you consider them to be obsolete at this point. Thank you for your work. I agree with her. And remember, this is just me, although I'm representing the Fed because I'm just speaking off the cuff here. I agree with her that the fees are too, and this was also Don who brought up that the fees are so much higher in San Rafael than they are elsewhere. And this is not just for developers. I believe this because I think all of the city should not have to pay such high fees. It's disturbing as someone who, we've added onto our house, we built our house. It's just such a huge, it's such an onerous part of being a resident here. So I'd like that to be looked at. I also agree about tiny houses. I think they're just such an innovation and really are can be and should be not just blanketly approved, but should be a part of the mix. Also agree about the sort of siloization of approval, that there should be much more cross-departmental discussion and less redundancy. Joanne brought up a really good point when she mentioned that that there's a lot of back and forth because I don't know, and this is with all due respect to the staff, but we have a lot of new staff here in planning. And it just seems like there's a lot of reinventing of the wheel and people aren't necessarily talking with each other before projects go forward, and may not even have the correct information. So the live work, let's face it, everyone's doing that now, wherever they're living, they're working. So I agree with you on that as well. On the covered garage, I just have a question. The slide that you showed said requirement of 2, covered spaces. When we built our house, there was also a requirement for 2 uncovered spaces for guests. Is that no longer the case? Allie?
So there's 2 covered spaces for single family. There's only additional guest parking required if you're in the hillside lots or if you're green multi-family.
Thank you. And then as far as other constraints, I don't know if you want to put that slide back up, Barry. I'm not a developer and I'm not like Joanne looking out for workers, in our city. I look at, and this may sound weird, I look at the fact that our city and its history, its historic structures, and the character of the way that the streets are laid out was really a gift from our forefathers. And I'm very, very cautious about streamlining development for developments, in order to get these housing, these units that RENA requires built. So if that's considered a restraint, I consider it restraint, but I consider it really a responsibility of every resident and really every developer in the area to appreciate that, we have a city here and people like the city. And if we're just streamlining everything, and I see one of us not wanting to hear this, but if we're just streamlining everything, making everything easy for approval, and we basically throw out the baby with the bathwater, we'll just have a city that maybe you can squeeze more people into, but that may not be as pleasant to live in. And so I am extremely fascinated and interested in Grace Gaharty's suggestion. And I would like to know of the staff, maybe in the next report, whether it could have legs. If in fact we do have rental housing stock that is not being rented because the rents are so high, is there a way of making them more affordable? She suggested vouchers. Honestly, as someone who, as you probably know, I'm very active with the historic preservation group, San Rafael Heritage, that has their annual meeting tonight. We have learned, and I know developers know this too, that the cost of building rather than reusing historic structures is much higher. And you end up throwing away stuff that is often worth preserving for history's sake. So if there are buildings that are, in good shape and their rents are too high, I would really like to learn more about that to see if we couldn't, instead of only framing our discussion about where can we build, to sort of shift that framework and talk really more intelligently about using what we have. And in the end, I think it would be, maybe developers wouldn't make as much money, but in the end, if you look at the balance sheet, lowering the fees, right? Putting people where, and this would also speak to John, I think it was John who spoke about segregated neighborhoods. It would speak to integrating neighborhoods probably much better, is finding units that exist that are clearly overpriced and make them affordable. I think that the good news would spread that way from neighborhood to neighborhood, and we wouldn't necessarily lose how our city looks to streamlined development that is just, well, we're trying to build, right? So that's where I'm coming from, Barry.
Okay, Amy, thanks. And I'm going to go to Cesar next, and then Daniel. We haven't heard from you guys yet today, and then we'll come back to others who have their hands up who have spoken earlier. Cesar. Sure.
And my attention is placed on the transitional and supportive housing with regards to just, there's an existing law. I'm reading this one section in which it states no emergency shelter shall be located within 300 feet of another emergency shelter unless permitted through review and approval of conditional use permit, where it is determined that the additional shelter location is appropriate and necessary to serve the intended population and would not result in an over concentration in the community. So I'm bringing this up in part as it relates to the upstream motion of unhoused to transitional housing to supportive housing, that because we have such a need and desire in a crisis with unhoused populations, that I wanted to see if there's a special attention accommodation, even if it's a temporary injunction, temporary rules to be relaxed, just to get the motion and the wheels rolling, to accommodate or build temporary solutions for now, right? To really, by relaxing some of these restrictions and ordinances, to make accommodations for nonprofits or organizations to really set shop in a way that is by and large dignified, needs to be dignified, for these folks, because it's a conundrum in which you got the state, Caltrans, pushing folks, it's a continuous kicking the can down the road, if you will. Right. So, and we obviously have a high concentration of unhoused populations in the city. So I just wanted to sort of put some attention and some considerations to that population, to consider looking at some of these existing ordinance and languages. And quite frankly, there's another piece here in which it states that the city will amend zoning code section, 1416, 115 to clarify requirements for staff and services to be provided to assist residents in obtaining permanent shelter and income are permissive rather than mandatory, and B, clarify that while a written management plan is required, it is not subject to discretionary approval. So some attention being placed on that is what I'd ask and request the city to consider.
Thanks, Cesar. I just had one follow-up question. What you were just reading from, is that the municipal code or
it's from the document that was sent.
Okay, so that's from the previous housing element. Yeah.
Right.
So I think there have been some changes made to the municipal code since then that we'll update. We'll bring that up because the state law on emergency shelters has changed. And yeah, some of those separation standards are different now. And so, yeah,
and that's why I want to put some attention to that, because this is like the crosswalk, like what's been accomplished and what hasn't. And then I
absolutely
get more educated on that level of detail.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Let's go to Daniel.
Thanks, Barry. I'm trying to organize my thoughts because I probably could want to talk to each point made for quite a while, but I'll try to minimize it. First point of clarification for the opportunity map shown, both high and highest resources is scoring points right now for TCAC. So it's not just the highest resource in the dark blue, but the high resource, which only increases the map by a little bit. But just wanted to make that point. I wanted to mirror Tom's comments on parking. I can't tell you how many deals come across our desk to do affordable housing and we can't park it. It is so expensive to park cars, and given the constraints of, that a lot of cities have, and the cost of affordable housing, we can't do under subterranean parking. It will almost never pencil for us as 100% affordable developers. So essentially, we're taking up a full floor with a podium, and that is one less level of housing for human beings, and it's housing for cars. So I do encourage you to look at that. I do encourage you to think about TOD zoning overlays. So if you are near areas, with high transit opportunities or that are very walkable, TOD overlays are often options in municipalities for taking a look at that without necessarily changing the underlying zoning code. I wanted to
What's a TOD? Sorry, what's TOD?
Oh, TOD stands for Transit Oriented Development. So around areas that have either rapid or many transit options, to summarize briefly. The comments on the density for public sites and quasi-public sites, I wanted to add to that. Often these sites are being identified for affordable housing now. There's state laws that if there's excess land for in these publicly owned excess land that's being disposed, supposed to at least go forth to affordable housing first, and it is often being earmarked for affordable housing throughout the state. So I would really encourage looking at having a higher baseline to start with there. Streamlining. I know we all don't agree on streamlining, but I just want to make a statement that, the word streamlining and high density shouldn't be the boogeyman. I just have a feeling people imagine giant Soviet style block housing that's going to be built because it's streamlined and it's high density, and that's just not the case. It's really talking about making sure the goalposts don't move, so that when I'm going to design a building, I know what we should be designing, and I don't have to go back to the drawing board for years on end, which I have personally experienced, and that costs serious money. And for affordable housing, it torpedoes deals, and it's just having a set standard that if you meet, you can move forward, should not be that much of a contentious issue, but I know it is. And I will just give a statement by saying, I wasn't able to entitle 140 units in the city of Sacramento in 5 months because of their new ordinance. Now, San Rafael is not Sacramento, and I'm not saying it should be Sacramento. And I probably shouldn't have said that out loud because everyone will accuse me of turning San Rafael into Sacramento. But we were so confident in that process that we were confident enough to buy the piece of land and get it entitled before we even bought it. This is very powerful. It gave us a lot of confidence to move forward in something and put a lot of cash on the line. And these are the type of things that aren't necessarily considered when you talk about the time, the amount of committees that you have to go to. We will often have to walk away from an option agreement because we just aren't confident that this thing is going to get through the city in a time frame that we feel comfortable putting cash on the table, especially as a nonprofit. To that note, for streamlining and overlays, I did send Barry some literature on that a couple months ago. I don't know if that ever got circulated, but I would encourage Barry to take a look back at those emails and take a look about circulating those for anyone who wants to see other Bay Area communities that are doing this. The topic of fees came up. From affordable housing perspective, one of the ways that a lot of cities can help an affordable housing developer gain momentum in applying for other funding is a fee waiver, because that is considered public funding. So whatever the impact fees that would occur, if that is waived, I can, without actually the city spending a dollar, I can take that and show that to the state and say the city has contributed X amount of money to this deal, which helps snowball the public funding cycles that occur. So I just wanted to make a point there. I also had a note just on general construction costs. Right now is crazier than I've ever seen. We're getting increases of 1% construction cost a month right now, which is out of control. And it's just hard to plan on this. And this is also ties to the length it gets entitled and approved. I can get a financing plan together, but if it's kicked down a year, I have to get a new financing plan together. And if that's affordable housing, that means waiting for a state funding cycle that doesn't necessarily meet my timeline. So that could be another 6 to 8 months of delay. And then again, I have to build in an even higher cushion for construction costs right now. And then there was a comment about converting existing buildings into affordable housing. I'm not here to comment on a 1-by-1 unit measure, but there are cases of nonprofits buying full apartment buildings and taking them, and then adding a regulatory agreement on them to make them affordable. It's what's called naturally occurring affordable housing, and it's to make sure that they don't. So usually the tenants there would qualify, and maybe they're lower rents, and a nonprofit will come in and make improvements to the building, and then put a regulatory agreement on the property in exchange for funding to make those improvements. It's very challenging, partially because if the tenants that are currently there are not actually all meeting the AMI levels that you need to get the funding, then you lose a lot of that funding. So it's a very tricky balance, and it can be done. There's some good examples of organizations doing that around the Bay Area, specifically an organization called Abaltsi which is the East Bay Local Asian Development Corporation. They're doing that a lot in Oakland, looking for naturally occurring affordable buildings and buying them before someone can buy them and flip them and take a market rate. So some food for thought there, but it's a very challenging avenue to go down. But since it was mentioned, I wanted to bring up that point. And I can go on, but I think I should cede my time to the group.
Thanks, Danielle. Great comments. And I'd also encourage anyone who has more to say, but is conscious of the time, to email me and the rest of the city staff with your ideas and thoughts on this. This is one of those topics that kind of sinks in over time, and we don't expect to cover everything today, but we hope that you'll all be giving thought to this and letting us know your thoughts. We need to wrap this item up in a few minutes, but there are a bunch of hands up, and I don't know if they're because you have more comments or because they didn't get put down, but I see Joanne, Linda, and Don, and anyone who hasn't spoken who would like to on this topic, feel free to raise your hand. Let's go to Linda.
Thank Yeah, I'll be brief. I just want to support what Omar said about the conversions and waivers or whatever we can do to eliminate fees and conditions of approval for projects that are conversion projects. And any of the items that are added on as expenses to that, especially for nonprofits who are building affordable housing. And then finally, the other thing I just want to note on all the rentals that supposedly are not going. So I just did a quick check at Craigslist, and about half the 522 rentals that are on Craigslist were posted in the last 2 weeks. And we're coming into that time of the year when everybody's shuffling around their apartments and finding something better, or something more affordable, or something larger or smaller. And so we'll see that the vast majority of them are for 2 bedrooms. So if you're looking for a small unit, or you're looking for a bigger unit, they're not there. There's like 4. So I just, we have a mismatch of our housing supply, and we have a desperate lack of housing for the 10,000 people who are working here, who need, who are low income and need affordable housing in Marin County. So.
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, I just, and to add a data point to that as well, we did look at the changes in the rental vacancy rate between the last housing element and this housing element, and it's a tighter market now. Granted, the last element was done as we were already kind of out of the recession, but it was still, some of the data may have been from 2012 when there was a high vacancy rate due to the recession, but it is a tighter market now than it was. It would be great to hear from property managers and some of the rental landlords and rental management companies in the city to hear more about what they're seeing in the market and why there are vacancies in certain categories. So we'll look into that. It's interesting information. Don and then Lorenzo, and then I think we'll wrap up the item.
Briefly, I wanted to follow up on Linda's questioning whether we should continue to utilize density in our zoning. And I recall that years ago at a planning conference, I presented an idea that maybe is worth thinking about now, and that is historically zoning density has been determined based on kitchens per acre, and suggested that maybe a better way of regulating land use would be look at either size or bedrooms per acre, because obviously there's a significant difference between 30 1,200 square foot units and 30 2,400 square foot units. And when you use kitchens, which is a definition of a unit, you actually end up encouraging larger units and not smaller, and as a result, more affordable and more starter homes, homes for senior citizens. Anyway, it reminded me of something I proposed a long time ago.
Yeah, thanks, Don. Lorenzo?
Just real briefly, one of the barriers that I didn't see and we haven't talked about, and I know us as developers, we run up against this, but in speaking on behalf of Eden Housing, we, as an example, had a project that's been under development for some time in the city of Livermore, and approved by the city. And we ran up against opposition from the community. And the opposition went into litigation for over a year. And because of the litigation, the project has been stalled, and we had to return $68 million of tax credits that was lined up to afford to build the project. And so, as you can imagine, not only did we lose out, but having to reapply and now having to adjust to the market conditions with that project raises the cost. So one of the barriers that we haven't really talked about is the human component of just the name or the context around affordable housing. And so just by the subject of affordable housing, we run up against oppositions in the communities that sometimes can derail the projects, even though we've done all the work that you all have talked about have already been approved, planned, and green lighted. And yet we run up against that big elephant in the room, and that is the community. So I think that needs to be talked about, addressed, and discussed as we are moving forward with affordable housing. So,
thanks. Yeah, thanks, Lorenzo. It's a good point and sobering to think about the loss of those tax credits as well. Great point. That's a good segue too into our next meeting topic, which is fair housing and equity. Is really how we think about affordable housing. I saw John's hand up. I don't know if John, if you wanted to make a final comment.
Oh yeah, just real quickly. I know you want to move on, but just I'm a huge advocate of the overlay concept, and hopefully we could front load that community input that would result in avoiding that sort of backlash that Lorenzo is talking about, and also get that sort of like streamlined permitting, streamlined but acceptable permitting that Daniel was talking about. But just before we leave this topic, I'm just trying to wrap my head around like all the different nuances of this. And I was just wondering if, the area around Paul Drive, just to use as an example, which is a commercial light industrial zone. I don't think we can put housing there, right? Is that, could I confirm that? And if that's the case, what are the obstacles there?
I see. Ali, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah. So anything that's zoned light industrial does not allow residential.
Okay.
And we've been really careful about the industrial districts in general.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot. There aren't a lot in the county, and once conversion happens, you're not getting the light industrial back. So we're very careful about when somebody is requesting, we really do a deep dive and evaluate whether this is really the changes, outweighs the loss of the district. So normally don't support changes to the light industrial.
Okay. And are there any, not to dwell on this point too much, but are there any precedents for cities allowing mixed use light industrial and housing?
Yeah, there are some. I think there are a couple of neighborhoods in Oakland where there's they call it housing and business mix. It's more a reflection of historical patterns where those uses are next to each other because the neighborhood was developed in the 1890s, or the pre-zoning land use patterns. It's less common where the area was developed in the 60s and 70s, and unless you're really trying to reinvent the pattern of the city and create what we call innovation districts or something like that. I would say the solution in this case wouldn't be to change to add housing as a permitted use in the light industrial, but rather to look really selectively at individual sites within the industrial area that may happen to be next to transit or close to transit. So for example, the public storage site that's near the Civic Center station, which had light industrial or office zoning, we would change that to allow housing because it's right next to a station, versus just saying, okay, now we're going to allow housing everywhere in light industrial. Linda, I know you wanted to add a comment.
So it is all about preserving this jobs-rich land. But I'll say we have it all over San Rafael. My lovely little apartment building's right next to an auto repair shop. And in the Canal neighborhood, you have residential multifamily apartments right next to jobs all over the neighborhood. So I wonder whether in the light industrial office and whether this would make sense for developers is to allow a redevelopment of a light industrial office site as long as the existing square footage of light industrial office is retained. So you still have that job space and those that use, but you're adding housing above it. And, all over Europe is full of apartments on top of tire stores, tire shops. So it happens in the rest of the world. I just wonder whether we would consider that if there's no net loss of the light industrial office space, is that okay to be adding residential? And construction, apartments are built now to handle the noise that happens. There really are very few noxious smells that happen. So all that can be handled with an administrative use permit, perhaps. But it's a way to perhaps look at that. Joanne might have some other thoughts. So I know the chamber, we're very careful. We don't want to lose any of that space, those uses.
We don't have time. It's a slippery slope, and I get really, really worried about that because, there are some people who will live above a woodworking shop, but they're not going to want to smell those odors, and they're not going to want to live above an auto repair shop where their baby's sleeping and somebody's working till 9 p.m. So I just don't know if in our county, if this is the right place for this change. That's my two cents.
Thanks, Linda and Joanne. And we did promise in our agenda an opportunity for public comment on this item. And I did want to see before we move on to the next item, if there were any members of the public who wanted to comment on the conversation, the discussion that we've just had, keeping in mind that there will be another opportunity for public comment right before the end of the agenda, just for more general comments. So any specific public comments on this item in this discussion? I don't see any hands up just yet. Nope. Okay, so we're going to keep going. Item 5D can be a fairly brief conversation. I think really what we wanted to do here is kind of lay out where we're headed with the conversations we're having. We're actually kind of winding down the data collection and analysis part of the housing element and are moving toward policies and programs. So we're going to have another conversation at the May meeting, the third Thursday in May, on what we call affirmatively furthering fair housing, and providing some of the data on that and having a conversation about equity and inclusion in housing. And we're going to then, that's actually the last scheduled meeting of the working group, but I think we're going to ask you to bear with us and attend one and possibly two additional meetings most likely in June to review draft policy and program language. The working group has been really great so far with providing reactions to the data and reactions to some of the topic areas that we've talked about, but what we haven't asked you for yet are your reactions to draft policies and programs, which we're in the process, we're now beginning to develop. That's probably the most important contribution you all can make, is telling us, this program doesn't go far enough, or this program is missing some key elements, or this policy really needs to be worded differently. So this is really just to sort of ask you guys if it's okay to stick around for two additional meetings that may be scheduled in June. We haven't picked dates or times yet, but we're working toward having a draft housing element out for public review by the beginning of July. So it's a fairly quick turnaround as we begin this drafting process. So I'm putting that out there just to see if the working group has any reaction or response to that. You're willing to take part in two more meetings in June, and if there are any thoughts or feedback about the way the working group can best contribute to that process.
Just to clarify, Barry, 2 additional meetings in June, meaning 2 meetings in June, right?
Correct. Yeah, we don't have a June meeting scheduled right now. And I see, Don, your hand is up.
My question was, is the working group going to have an opportunity to review the housing opportunity sites? I've been kind of waiting for that, particularly in my role as the environmental representative, to see where these sites that are going to be in the housing element actually are. But
yeah, Yeah, you will have that opportunity. I mean, I think it'll be part of the opportunity that we provide to the public as a whole. We'll be publishing that list. Part of what we're doing now is getting owner notification, property owner notification of those sites taken care of before we finalize the list. So that's part of the delay. But yes, I guess the question is, will we agendize that as an item? And that's really something I think when we put the draft list out, we'll make sure we do that.
Good.
Thanks.
Do you think that information could be available for the May meeting?
We'll try. We'll try. Yeah. Thanks. And Joanne?
I just wanted to know if the city is tracking or can get
Have a good
access
weekend.
to the list of the underutilized public sites. You know, like if like a school or a sewer district site, something like that.
We're kind of developing that list. I mean, that's there isn't one specific source called the underutilized public land site, but we're I think, you know, we've made an assessment. You know, we've contacted school districts, and the city itself has a number of properties. We're talking to Dominican, for example, and some of the other, not necessarily public, but quasi-public agencies about opportunities. The County of Marin is another party we've been speaking to. So that's part of the overall list.
Can we get access to that, please? Can we
Yeah,
have that list.
Sure. It's a work in progress. It'll be kind of part of the same inventory as all of the sites.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay, any other comments or hands up? I hope the lack of hands means you're okay with meeting 2 more times in June. Okay, thank you all. We'll work with you on those dates. Then member and staff announcements, and I'll ask, actually, I was going to put Linda on the spot here because I was going to ask you about the Youth and Arts and Y Plan program. If was that today that they presented their?
And I'll try to be really brief. So I met with the 3rd grade class at Laurelsdale Elementary School, which is over by Davidson Middle School. So about 24 little kids sharing their plans for housing in San Rafael. And I'll tell you what they talked about. They had teams of 3. So one team talked about houseboats. So I don't know whether we can work with BCDC and get the percentage of people who can live on a houseboat up, but that's one. Another one is co-housing, what we can do to promote co-housing, because certainly our policy has not done zilch in 30 years. Tiny housing, they had a whole little tiny house community that they showed. High-rise buildings. I asked them, what is a high-rise building? And they said 5 stories. Micro units, which are very, very small units for one person basically to sleep at night. Very good for young folks. And then navigation centers. So a navigation center to help someone find housing and find services. ADUs. And the one thing that just was such a, and reusing old buildings. So that goes along with maybe some of what Omar might be looking at. One thing that I noticed in almost all of their plans, they had at least one pool. So we need a pool in the Canal neighborhood, folks. This is in central San Rafael for people to be able to go swimming. So it was a wonderful experience. Thanks for letting me share.
Thank you. Other announcements? Anyone? Upcoming events or things we should know about? Go ahead, Joanne.
Oh, thank you, Barry. The San Rafael Chamber will be hosting our annual State of the City Dinner and Business of the Year Awards with the City of San Rafael. And Mayor Kate will give the annual mayoral address, and will recognize Business of the Year, Citizen of the Year, and City Employee of the Year. It is on Monday, May 23rd, and we are hosting it outdoors underneath the lights on A Street in downtown San Rafael.
Nice, great. Thank you. Okay, and Allie or Alexis, did you want to make any announcements or any final comments before we go to our last public comment?
I do not have anything. Thanks, Barry.
Okay, great. So let's go to our last public comment opportunity, just general comments on housing related items for those who are in attendance. Alexis, if you could see if there's anybody there.
So far, I'm not seeing any raised hands. We'll give everybody just another moment. If you would like to make a public comment, now would be the time to go ahead and raise your hand. I'm
No
not seeing
comments?
anyone.
Okay,
No.
great, great. Thank you. And I believe our next meeting is May 19th. Am I correct on that date? Third Thursday,
That's correct, May 19th.
4 o'clock, May 19th. Great. Oh, Amy, did you want to say something before we go?
Right, I did. I would really appreciate, and I think that this is actually required in a public meeting in person, if our guests would identify themselves rather than just having a phone number, with a last name, just how we used to do this when we would speak at the microphone. I think I'm interested in who's attending our public meetings. I'm very happy that we have participants, but I'd like to know who they are.
Okay, we'll take that under advice. Yep. Thank you. Okay, I think once again, we're wrapping up right at the 6 o'clock close time. So thank you all for being here, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Barry.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.